Assyrians are an ancient race of people originating from the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, also known by the Greek name Mesopotamia. They are the original and indigenous people of the land framed by the Persian Gulf, the Van Sea, the Urmia Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. This region is now occupied by Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. The Assyrian Empire reigned until 612 BC. Thereafter, the Assyrians continued to inhabit their indigenous homelands. During various stages of history, the Assyrian population underwent sovereignty changes and consequent assimilation processes of religion, language, and culture. However, the dominance of the Turkish Ottomans from the 15th century to the first part of the 20th century completely reshaped the destiny of the Assyrian people. And those few millions who had withstood the melting process of the millennia and had remained homogeneous in their ancestral homeland became the victims of one of the worst Assyrian genocides in the early part of the 20th century. Cradle of Civilization, the ancient Assyrian civilization, is the first recognized and documented civilization and is responsible for the development of almost every initial component of the modern civilization. They were pioneers in the fields of politics, state administration, economics and trade, cultural and artistic expression, agriculture and animal husbandry, military development, medicine, science, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and law as demonstrated by the first written code of law, the Code of Hammurabi. The Assyrians were also among the first people to convert to Christianity, tracing their Christian origin to Christ, to contribute to the building of early churches, and to go on Christian missions to China, Japan, Indonesia, and India. Today, all Assyrians are Christians of various denominations, predominantly Orthodox and Catholic. Their relentless adherence to the Christian faith has placed the Assyrians in a situation of constant attack, barbarism, and attempted annihilation by the Islamic forces which now occupy their traditional homes. The Assyrian Christians have endured centuries of massacres and atrocities in defense of their cultural identity and their Christian faith. The last phase of the Ottoman Empire in 1842 AD saw a massive attack on Assyrians in the mountains of Hakkari and the death of tens of thousands of Christian Assyrians. 1895 to 1896 witnessed the Assyrian massacres in Diyarbakir, Hasankeyf, and Sivas in Anatolia by Sultan Abdul Hamid II. This attack alone caused the death of over 55,000 Assyrians and the forced Osmanization of a further 100,000 Assyrians, the inhabitants of 245 villages. In addition to this, a further 100,000 Assyrian women and children were forced into the Turkish harems. The Turkish troops looted the remains of the Assyrian settlements, taking old gold, silver, and other possessions. The Assyrians were raped, tortured, and murdered. Then in the year 1911, the Young Turk Committee for Unity and Progress declared its goal to Osmanize all Turkish subjects. This pan-Turkeyism became known as the Dark Period of ethnic and religious cleansing of the Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek Christians in the Turkish Republic. A systematic extermination of the Assyrian people, which continues to this day, has caused the population of Assyrians in that region, previously numbering millions, to diminish to a mere few thousand. These few Assyrians today fight to remain free Christians in their traditional homeland. The events of 1915 became known as the Year of the Sword in Assyrian history. One such massacre on 5 June 1915 saw the death of tens of thousands of Assyrian Christians in the region between Hasankeyf and Turabdin. Eyewitness accounts tell of the bludgeoning of little children with stones, the dismembered bodies of women and girls who refused to be raped, the beheading of men and those who would not convert to Islam, and the burning and skinning alive of priests, nuns, and deacons. Those who survived this barbarism were left to brave famine, thirst, disease, and a hostile environment. A report from Deacon Asmar from the village of Ain-Vardo, now known by its Turkish name Gulgus, in Turabdin, reveals that some 12,000 Turkish soldiers, accompanied by Turkish civilian women and children, descended on the Assyrian village. It was the task of the Turkish civilians to loot the village while the soldiers killed its inhabitants. The attack on the village resulted in a battle lasting 2 months and 6 days as the Assyrian villagers fought back in defense. Risko Shabo speaks about this incident.
They attacked Midyat. We gathered on the roof of the house of Isa the Bigori. We heard that some escaped to Ain-Vardo. After 3 days of fighting, they took Midyat, and we went to the roof of Bet Adoga. Blood was pouring from the roof gutters of every house.
Jalila Musa Gorgas tells of the village of Seird and of the deportation of Assyrians from their villages. She tells of being rounded up like cattle by Turkish soldiers and being made to march for days in the harsh climate with little food and water. The villagers, consisting mainly of women, children and the elderly, were subjected to beatings, rapes and constant abuse. Both Jalila and her 8-year-old daughter were among the many women raped by the Turkish soldiers. According to Jalila, those who became too weak to march were killed along the way by the Turkish soldiers. The deported villagers also suffered numerous raids and attacks by the provoked Kurdish bandits in search of valuables and clothing. The Muslims would descend upon the already weakened group, attacking them with stones and daggers and tearing off their clothing. Jalila remembers, "I wanted to escape as I saw a naked woman who had a dagger thrust in her stomach. She was trying to push back her out-hanging bowels. She wanted to escape from the monster too.
My name is Georgis Zorzan. I am about 100 years old. The Turks entered our village of Gardiani. They were attacking our elderly with spears and swords. They burned our churches. They provoked the Kurds to take our women and rape them. They went to many families and forced them to become Muslims. Those that refused to convert were slaughtered. They made us drink water from the horses' buckets.
Yegu David from Berija in Homeh recalls,
Our people suffered brutality under the Turkish rule. I was about 20 years old when the Assyrian massacres were taking place. I was married. The Turks and Kurds killed 400 of our villagers and burned our churches and forced us out of our village. My friend Nisan was killed, but I was pleased that Yohanna was still alive during the attack. Nisan's wife, Hinne, was kidnapped. Many of our girls were forcefully taken by the Turks. Our villages were raided and we had to flee for our life. On the way, we abandoned my brother Elisha, who was sick, and his wife covered him and he died there.
an Assyrian monk Doroyo from Diyarbakir reported that
noses of priests were pierced with rings and dragged by chains in the streets. Pregnant women's wombs were slashed and their babies were ripped out and thrown against walls. Many virgins were committing suicide to avoid rape by the Turks. The elderly were killed brutally. Properties and lands were confiscated. Graves were upturned in order that any buried gold may be extracted from them. Tens of thousands of the villagers were violently and mercilessly driven out of their homes. I would not wish this Holocaust upon our enemies.
Another eyewitness says,
We went to the villages and saw dead human bodies piled up on top of one another, blackened by the sun. There was hunger and death. People of Bet Zabde left for Mosul. Groups upon groups fled to Mosul. I don't remember the massacre in Boghianus. I know that we could not defend ourselves from the Muslim Turks. In Hemisan, our people were attacked. Our women threw themselves into wells to escape kidnapping by the Muslim Turks. Some women were undressed and killed. Some were kidnapped, and others were burned in front of the church.
there are innumerable accounts of similar atrocities by those who survived the attempted genocide. The accounts confirm the endless brutalities inflicted on the Assyrians by the Islamic Turkish forces in their attempt to rid the region of Christians. Prior to World War I, Assyrians lived as one nation, numbering millions and inhabiting the more than 750 villages of the Taurus, Dorabdin, Hakkari, Botan, Tigris, Urmia and Mosul, and in the larger towns of Urhey, Diyarbakir, Mardin, Baghdad, Aleppo and Damascus. Aside from enjoying political, religious and cultural unity, they were autonomous as a nation of people under the religious and spiritual patriarchy of Marbenyamin Shumun. In fact, Shumun was authorized by the Turkish government to handle and resolve all local matters and disputes pertaining to the Assyrian nation. Shumun was chosen to be patriarch in 1903 when he was 17 years old. From a young age, he became the one to witness the hardship that his Assyrian people would suffer until his assassination by the Kurds in 1918. As early as 1906, however, political tension and anxiety were perceived by Shumun in the region. Indeed, this tension and anxiety was felt by all non-Turkish nationalities in that region, and their fears were crystallized by the coming to power in 1908 of the Young Turks. E.V. Tal defined the sole objective of the Young Turks as being
to settle all national problems by destroying all nationalities except Turks, and those who would agree to become Turkish promptly.
The Assyrians were of particular interest to the Turks, as the Turks feared their alliance with the Kurds and or the Russians. Initially, Turkey sought to avert such an alliance by feigning political and social support for the Assyrians. Early in October of 1914, the governor of Van, Dervish Effendi, gave promises of favour and immunity to the Assyrians through their patriarch Marbenyamin Shumun. In addition to this, there were promises of new schools and hospitals and financial support of the Assyrian clergy. This promise was exchanged for a written pledge made by Shumun on behalf of the Assyrian people, stating that they would not side with the Russians in the event of conflict. Such agreements clearly show that Turkey was at that time anticipating the commencement of conflict, and in particular of World War I. In fact, the Turkish Home Affairs Minister was reported to have revealed the intention of the Turks to utilize the ensuing war as a cover for their push towards ethnic cleansing. The cover of war, it was said, would allow them to rid their land of Christians and non-Turks without fear of international and political reprisals. The cover of war was much welcomed by the Young Turks, who saw violence and massacres as an unavoidable and acceptable mechanism by which to attain their goal of total Osmanization of all Turkish subjects. As such, the mass destruction of all non-Turkish elements was systematically and callously planned by the Young Turks Party. This plan was given the wholehearted support of Dr. Nazim, a committee member of the party, stating,
"Massacre is inevitable. I want only Turks to be independent in this land."
And Enver Pasha, Minister of Foreign Affairs, had declared,
"I'm not going to tolerate any Christians in Turkey."
To further increase the onslaught against the Assyrians, the Turks won the alliance of the Kurds by means of bribery and artillery. In making this bargain, the Kurds were given freedom to raid the Assyrian villages at will, and hence carried out a lot of the killing on behalf of the Turks. In addition to the arms and financial bribes offered to the Kurds, the Turks used anti-Christian and political propaganda to instill fear and hatred into the hearts of Persian and Kurdish Islamic forces. It was also rumoured by the Turks that the Assyrians were armed for attack by Russia. In September of 1914, the newspaper Baku reported the fiery destruction of some 30 Assyrian villages and the death of over 200 Assyrians who were burned alive. The newspaper reported,
Among those victims were old men, women, and children alike.
On October 3, 1914, the Russian Vice-Consul Vedensky, together with the local governor, visited the villages of Angar and Lavach, the sites of bloody massacres. Mr. Vedensky described what he saw as ferocious sights of jihad. He recalls seeing the burned bodies of slaughtered families, the remains of their burnt houses and homes that were still alight. In a correspondence dated 24 October 1914, Vice-Consul Vedensky spoke of Turkey's repressive actions against Assyrians in Shamdinan. He confirmed the growing daily number of Assyrian refugees to Urmia and the regions of Iran, and echoed the cry for help sent to the Russian consul by Markhnanish earlier that month. The following day, over 600 Assyrian refugees poured into Iran. The numerous pleadings to the Russians for help and armament of the Assyrians went virtually unanswered by Russia until Vedensky's interception of a coded message from the Turkish consul in Urmia. The message revealed the Turkish plan to capture the entire Urmian region for use as a base for future military action. The Russians were now ready to pay attention, and to avert the Turkish threat, they now turned to the Assyrians for manpower, inviting them to join the Allies against Turkey. In response and in anticipation of Russian support, Mar Benjamin Shuman promised aid to the Russian consul in Van by way of 40,000 volunteer Assyrian troops. These 40,000 volunteer troops were armed by Russia with a mere 2,500 rifles and shells. Ironically, fearing the strong Turkish force in Urmia and isolation from the main Russian forces, the Russian consul Vorontsov Dashkov ordered the withdrawal of his troops from the region, leaving the Assyrians to fight the Turks alone and with inadequate resources. The Assyrian volunteer troops were not even informed of the withdrawal. They stood firm and fought the Turks, believing they had the support of Russian troops. The resultant devastation of Assyrian volunteer troops and civilians is attested to in the numerous eyewitness accounts and letters to General Vorontsov Dashkov. One such letter told of horrific destruction by Turkish and Persian troops.
98 settlements were demolished. Villages were stripped naked. Males were murdered, and women, maidens and children were all taken captive.
The historical archives of the new Republic of Georgia hold the direct orders of Javdat Pasha of the Turkish forces to cut down any Assyrians found in the Dilman and Gevutan regions. The Baku newspaper on 5 March 1915 told of the destruction of all 20 Assyrian villages in Dilman and the scattered bodies of Assyrians who had been murdered using axes, daggers and blunt instruments. The situation was critical. In November of 1914, Turkey entered the war with Germany as its ally. Outnumbered Assyrians were pressed to the mountains, far from the Russian-Turkish front line. The Turkish forces started arming the Kurds and provoking them against their Christian neighbours. The Turks also imprisoned the Patriarch's brother and other members of his family.
Your brother's life will be saved if your people promise to stop negotiating with the Russians and keep quiet.
The Patriarch replied,
I am the leader of my people. I cannot betray a nation for one person, even if he is my brother.
Hormuz was executed together with the other members of the Patriarch's family. But the support that Russia had promised was not delivered. The Patriarch wrote letter after letter to the Russian High Command.
I'm informing you that for more than 1 month already, my people have been fighting in the mountains against Turkish and Kurdish forces. Turks have occupied our villages and burned them all. The Assyrians have fled into the mountains and are dying from starvation. We are surrounded by enemies. Our situation is desperate and hopeless. I am begging you to send troops here in the name of Christ.
The absence of support from Russia increased the frequency and ferocity of Turkish attacks on Assyrian troops, and an attack was launched against the remaining Assyrian villages in Hakkari. The Assyrians fought in 14 battles with the Turks, despite being severely undermanned and underarmed. The newspaper TAAAS cites eyewitness accounts saying,
And then the killing of Christians began. Almost every villager was murdered in 30 settlements of the Gawa region. If Russians should come to the rescue, Assyrians will be saved. Otherwise, all of about 50,000 will be destroyed, for the Assyrians have very few guns or shells.
All that the Russians could do was advise the Assyrians to fight the Turks towards the Russian army in Persia. The Patriarch had nothing else to rely on. Several 100,000 Assyrian women and children took the desperate journey on the snowy mountains, which lasted a month. Countless numbers of them failed to get through. Over 22,000 Assyrian men, women and children sought refuge in American and French missions in Urmia. Their hopes were cruelly dashed. Witnesses and survivors talk of beatings and humiliation in the missions. There are accounts of the public hanging of the Orthodox Bishop Mar Ilya, along with numerous priests and deacons. Within a period of 5 months, over 10,000 Assyrians died of famine, disease, and mistreatment in the missions. Their Russian allies did not respond to any cry for help. The Assyrians who were still alive then began the long journey from Urmia to Russia in the hope of being given refuge. The Baku newspaper reported a stream of mainly women and children moving over the 40-mile stretch from Urmia to Kushna. The Mashhad newspaper reported the journey of about 40,000 Assyrians riddled with peril, famine, disease, and the constant sight of dead and dying refugees along the way. Refugees who could not complete the long and harsh journey. By 1917, it was clear that Turkey would lose the war. The Russian allies had agreed to take the territory of Turkish Armenia, the Van region, the Assyrian mountain homelands, and Constantinople. But the start of the Russian Revolution in 1917 led to the disintegration of the Russian army and the eventual truce with Germany to cease all military action. The Russians withdrew from Persia while the Turks became prepared to take Azerbaijan. The Assyrians were left alone once again. On 16 March 1918, Simko, a Kurdish Agha, invited the Patriarch Mar Binyamin Shumun to his house in the pretense of making peace. But what was planned was an Islamic attack towards a powerful Christian leader. Mar Shumun was assassinated, as were but a few of his 300 men. By this time, more and more Turks went to Urmia ready to exterminate more Christians. Assyrians had to leave. Their only destination was Hamadan. Assyrians and the Armenians, totaling 250,000, joined together in a journey away from their homelands. Muslim enemies were all around. There was fighting along the way. Death was everywhere. They kept going. There was no water, only snow. The horses were dying. They took horses from the old men and gave them to the young ones. Stories are told of older mothers and fathers being left behind. The journey in the snow resulted in 50,000 people staying back on the mountains forever. The New York Times, June 4, 1922 reads,
"The Assyrian people, of whom the world has heard but little in comparison with the Armenians, but whose gallantry in war and suffering for their race is superior to that of any other allied nation."
The Assyrian nation lost over two-thirds of its population between 1914 to 1918 as a result of the atrocities committed by the Turks during that period. Yet the historical writings and the strands of journalistic and academic evidence about the Assyrian genocide have been ignored. At times, this dark event in human history has inadequately been termed by the West only as the genocide of the Armenians. The documentary material in Turkey is still not accessible for historical evaluation. The Turkish government has not yet come to terms with its past with reference to the expulsion and annihilation of its Christian population during the First World War. Today, the Assyrian people still exist and continue to live as Assyrians in their various adopted homelands, despite suffering the loss of over 750 villages and the lives of all their inhabitants during this untold Holocaust of the sword.